All right, guys. So for this lecture, we're going to take a little bit of just kind of introductory look into the respiratory system. And we're also going to get into just a few of the basic structures, mostly the nose and also the pharynx kind of leading into the top half of the respiratory system here. So let's go and kind of jump into this. So the respiratory system itself can actually be split up into two zones. So there's what's referred to as the conduction zone. So this is mostly everything upper level from the lungs up all the way to the nose. And it's usually referred to this because it's simply just the conducting passageway that ventilates or brings this air in and out of the lungs. The other portion then is the respiratory zone, and that is the lungs themselves, specifically the alveolar sacs, because this is where the actual exchanging of carbon dioxide and oxygen takes place. So conduction zone, which are some of the parts we're going to talk about over the next two lectures, are the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi. And you can see them here on the chart. So nose is essentially the external opening to the respiratory system. The oral cavity would also be an opening to the respiratory system as well, but normally we breathe in through our nose, or at least we try to as much as we can. The pharynx is the junction between the nasal, oral, and esophageal cavities. And then the larynx is the level at which our voice box kind of sits. And then from there on down, we have our trachea and then the two main bronchi that branch off of those. Okay. And like I said, the respiratory zone essentially is housed directly in each lung. So we're going to mostly take a look at the conduction zone over the next couple days here. All right, functions of the respiratory system. So obviously, it's the main purpose is to kind of oversee that exchange of gases between the external and internal environment, and then it's going to also exchange gases between the alveoli and the lungs as well as the blood. All right, so that's its main purpose there. The conduction passageway itself does have some basic functions. So it's there to help purify. So when we breathe in through our nose, a lot of those large impurities, things like mold, pollen, dust, viruses, and things like that fall out within the nose. It also is there to help warm that air as it goes into the lungs. Warm air is easier to exchange substances within than cold air because the molecules are further apart. And it also is there to humidify that air. The inside of the lungs needs a somewhat humidified environment to be able to exchange that back and forth because we're essentially exchanging things across tissue. And if it's dry, the membranes themselves will be dry, and then it's harder to exchange that. So those are our basic functions there. This is kind of what the upper respiratory tract kind of looks like. So we're going to start talking about things here of the nose, or what's referred to as the external nares. That's the opening within the nose, right? Directly inside of there are these three what look like shelves on both sides of the nose called concha. We'll talk a little bit about them. Then we have the opening at the back of the throat, which essentially is the nasopharynx. All right. The nasopharynx then joins up with the oropharynx. So the oropharynx is the mouth. All right. And then the last portion at the very bottom here is the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx connects both the naso and oral pharynx together and then directs them towards either the esophagus if we're swallowing food, or we go into the trachea, which would then bring air into the lungs. There's a small little flap that sits up here at the top that controls the opening of those two. All right. That is referred to as what's called the epiglottis. So when you swallow food, the epiglottis closes off the opening to the trachea so food doesn't make it down into there. And then when we breathe, it opens and allows air down into the lungs there. You can see there is some cartilage in and around there as well. There's several glands that we're going to talk a little bit about. So there's a couple tonsils that you can kind of see. There's a set at the base of the tongue called your lingual tonsils. There's a set that kind of hang down off of what's referred to as the uvula. That's that little flappy thing in the back of your throat. Those are your palatine tonsils that sit there. And then there are two sets of tonsils on both sides of there as well that we'll take a look at. Okay. All right. I'm going to embed these two in the assignment itself so you guys can take a look at the different processes, but it shows the difference between the respiratory treatment of air and the ventilation of that air. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and start with some basic structures here. So we'll start at the nose. The nose is the only external only part that is externally visible of the respiratory system. Air is going to enter through both sides, through the nostrils, which are also referred to as the external nares. Right, those are the two openings on both sides of the nose. And then the interior of the nose, like I was talking, has this cavity that's divided by a septum. That septum allows air to kind of fall down or go directly into both sides of the nostrils, and then follow that pathway in through the nasal cavity. Inside of the nasal cavity, we have a couple different things. So obviously we have our olfactory receptors, which allows us to kind of sense and smell different sensations. The rest of that cavity then is kind of lined with mucus, and that mucus is there to do a couple things. So number one, it helps moisten that air, and number two, it helps trap any of those foreign particles that would make it into the respiratory system: pollen, dust, viruses, bacteria, anything that we don't really want to make its way down in there. And then there are a set of very superficial blood vessels that line the inside of the nose, and they're there really to help us kind of warm that air as it kind of falls into that. But that's also why people sometimes will get nosebleeds, because these blood vessels are very superficial. And if we dry out this mucous membrane that's in there, we can actually cause the blood to leak out of those vessels. If you take any kind of a blood thinner, so either Coumadin or things like that, people who have heart problems sometimes will end up with nosebleeds, or even people who are alcoholics can end up with nosebleeds, because alcohol itself is a blood thinner. All right, so those are things that can kind of happen in there. And also any kind of blow or direct blow to the nose can also cause bleeding, because again, those are very superficial blood vessels. Okay. The next thing we'll talk a little bit about then is the nasal cavity itself. So I mentioned these before, but there are some of these projections that stick out from the sides of the nasal cavity. They are all called concha. All right, they're there for a couple different reasons. Number one, they increase surface area, so they allow for the ability to trap more dust and debris, and they also increase the surface area to warm that air. The other thing they also do is they increase the air turbulence, so they don't provide a smooth entrance of air. They allow that air to kind of mix and kind of marry within the nasal cavity, which causes some of those larger particles of dust, pollen, and bacteria and viruses to kind of fall out inside of the nose and be trapped. Okay, and then the nasal cavity itself is then separated from the oral cavity by a plate, right? Or sorry, palate, not plate, palate. So we've got the hard and soft palates. The hard palate is in the front, soft palate is towards the back. Soft palate is all muscle, kind of soft tissue, and hard palate is all bone. All right, so we look at those two. We also have some sinuses within the skull that help us out here. They're there for a couple different reasons. We'll talk about them here in a second. But sinuses that we have what are called frontal sinuses. Those are within the frontal bones up above the nose. All right. We also have sphenoidal sinuses. Right. Those kind of sit on either side of the eyes, kind of on the inside here. We have ethmoid sinuses. Those are kind of at the top portion of the eyes on both sides. Right, and then we have maxillary sinuses. Those are in the large bones on both sides of our cheeks. And those sinuses can become filled with mucus sometimes, or blocked off and become kind of plugged. And those can change things for us. All right. The main purpose of those sinuses for us is to help lighten our skull. If that was pure bone, our skull would be much heavier than what it is. They also act as resonance chambers for our speech, which is why if they're plugged or you got some kind of mucus drainage in them, sometimes your voice resonance will change. At least to you, you don't hear it as well, but a lot of times it doesn't sound that much different to everybody else. And they also help produce mucus that drains essentially into the nasal cavity, which will help trap some of that bacteria and dust and other foreign particles that get in there. Okay. Next section we'll talk a little bit about is the pharynx itself. So this is the junction between the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and then finally the esophagus and trachea. So it's a muscular passage that connects both the nasal cavity to the larynx. There are three separate sections. The upper section is the nasopharynx. So this is the back portion of the nasal cavity. All right, you can see it's highlighted here in green. The middle portion is the oral pharynx, so that's the yellow portion here. All right, so you can see here is the soft palate kind of draining down. This would be the uvula right here. And then the last portion is the laryngopharynx. So this is the very bottom portion from essentially the lower half of the oropharynx down into the esophagus or trachea. That portion is separated from each other by that little epiglottis, that little flap that kind of closes off the trachea to food and water, and then opens to allow the passageway of air. Okay. One of the things that does show up sometimes is specifically you might want to take a look at for the assessment. The oropharynx and laryngopharynx are common passageways for both air and food. We don't tend to drink too many things or eat things through our nose, but those two, specifically the yellow and blue shaded sections, are common passageways for both air and food. Okay. All right, last little bit, some of the structures that we see inside of the pharynx. So the auditory tubes actually drain into the nasopharynx, which is why if you're kind of got a plugged ear while you're swimming, or if you've gone scuba diving, or even gone up into an airplane, swallowing or chewing will sometimes help open those auditory tubes and drain that pressure that's in the ear into the pharynx. Okay, and then there are those tonsils we kind of mentioned about before. So there's a couple different sets. There's what's referred to as pharyngeal tonsils, which a lot of times are called adenoids. All right, those are up in the nasopharynx. They're kind of at the very bottom here. We have palatine tonsils, which are on both sides of the palate. Right, you can see one here and then one over there. A lot of times, when the doctor's looking inside of your throat, that's specifically what they're trying to look for, are those palatine tonsils. And most often, when people have to have tonsils removed, they have these removed, or they have the adenoid ones, the ones in the nose, removed. They don't tend to do that as much as they used to, but if people tend to have a lot of strep throat or sometimes bacterial infections in the throat, the tonsils are sometimes one of the ones we can if we remove, we can get rid of those. And the last one I have is the lingual tonsil, which is actually at the base of the tongue on the back. And those can also be kind of problematic if they become inflamed. Okay, but most often, if you have a sore throat or any kind of bacterial infection in the throat, those will swell because they're being filled with white blood cells, and we're trying to trap as much as we can in there and try to get rid of it before it makes its way even further into the respiratory system. Okay. All right, we're going to go and stop there. We'll pick up tomorrow with the rest of the structures for the respiratory system, for the conduction, and then we'll get into a little bit of the respiratory zone as well. So